A lot of people have been talking about the skeptic community, and it seems to be the prevailing opinion that there isn't one. The curious thing about this is that although a lot of people seem to think that there is no skeptic community here on YouTube, you never really see people explain why there isn't one. I think this is a real issue on the part of people who see it that way. Primarily because when you hold an opinion and then don't explain why you hold that opinion, you leave it up to the listener to draw their own conclusions on why you came to that thought. And if you're someone who really does not like being misconstrued, then it's certainly worth your time to make sure you're as explicit and as detailed as possible when you express your views to people. The other problem here is that when you don't explain why you think what you think, it completely stifles any reasonable debate on a topic. I mean, honestly, this whole community BS has been going on for nearly an entire year now. We're not contemplating the meaning of life here, we're just trying to answer the question of whether or not a title applies to a group of people. It's not that complicated. At the end of the day though, I think that's what this is all about. I think that the people who find the phrase community to be problematic have this idea that being part of a community implies that they're inside of some sort of hive mind or some sort of ideologically homogenous group. And again, since no one seems keen on explaining exactly why they think there isn't a community, this will just have to be my best guess as to what people think about it. And hey, I'm sure someone somewhere thinks this, so I may as well respond to it. The first question I have to ask is, why does the idea of a community invoke this kind of thought in people's minds? Where does this misconception come from? Well, as far as I can tell, this is a result of our own political battles. Even if we ourselves aren't ideologues, we have to immerse ourselves in the ideology of our opponents, and that ideology is deeply collectivist in nature. The kinds of people we respond to, and I say the kinds of people because it doesn't matter if it's alt-right or social justice, it's all generally the same thing but from a different aspect. These sorts of people have very many ways of being subversive in their language and have a very nasty habit of collectivizing everything. This is something that our interactions with them have trained us to be acutely aware of, and it does have some impact on our everyday lives. For example, when you watch television, if you watch television, do you find yourself picking up on the subtext of narratives being presented to you, as though the ability to do so is just second nature? Or maybe for a more extreme and more specific example, do you find yourself picking up bits and pieces of social justice narratives sprinkled into mainstream corporate programs, or maybe even the videos produced by some content creators here on YouTube who aren't in our sphere of influence, so to speak? As I said, these ideas are very subversive, and they typically prey on your good intentions. It can start with the thought that men and women are equal, which is difficult to disagree with, and I don't think most of us do. And then in small increments it makes its way to men and women should make the same amount of money. After all, women make less money than men. That is a fact. It's very easy to make the leap from this fact to the unproven statement that there is some kind of mass discrimination against women in the workplace that desperately needs to be dealt with. You give an inch, they take a mile. And for the casual observer, this is something that will go right over their head. And this is why we're so acutely aware of it. It's just plain necessary. But sometimes we see things that aren't really there. Imagine if you thought the Matrix was real. Literally red-pilled, my dudes. For us, this is something that we pride ourselves in being aware of and deconstructing. Not the Matrix, I mean our opponent's deceitful use of language. Chances are that one or both of these examples apply to you. And it's perfectly fine if neither of them do. You're honestly not missing out on much. Now, you might be wondering what the point of this tangent was. Why am I getting into this kind of thing? Before I express my thoughts on the whole community situation, I want to try to disarm you. Regardless of how you view it, I want to at least attempt to have us go into this as objectively as we possibly can. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for, which I'm sure many of you saw coming. Me personally, I'm happy to say that there is a skeptic community, and I know that's a controversial opinion to have, but hear me out. The way I see it, you've got a bunch of YouTubers who tend to upload videos on very similar if not the same topics. They all have overlapping subscribers and regular viewers, and they even communicate with each other from time to time. Sometimes because an issue comes up that requires collaboration, and sometimes just to have friendly chats or debates. That certainly does sound like a community, doesn't it? If not, then like I said, let's look at this objectively. What does it take for something to be considered a community? Well, the easiest way to figure this out is to look at the definition of the word community. So let's see here. Apparently we have to have some kind of group that share common characteristics or interests. Checkerino. And it needs to be perceived as, or perceive itself as being different from the larger society around it. Well, as far as I can tell, everyone who could be said to be in the skeptic community has been red-pilled. And that's a distinction between themselves and the rest of society at large, let alone the community of YouTubers as a whole. And even if some of them don't see it that way, there's still a definite outgroup. Normies. Or otherwise, people who aren't as well read or are completely inexperienced on the kinds of topics we normally talk about. I think just about everyone who shares interest in the kinds of topics we make videos about knows that there is a definite outgroup, and that outgroup is just based on being able to comprehend these topics in and of themselves. I can't exactly go up to some random person on the street and talk about the implications of social justice in universities, can I? They won't have any idea what I'm talking about, and I couldn't even explain it to them in a reasonable amount of time. But chances are that you, the viewer watching this video, would know what I was talking about and would be able to converse with me about that. And there is one other kind of person who would know what I was talking about and be able to converse with me if I brought it up randomly. And that kind of person is a social justice advocate. Not necessarily a social justice warrior, but they certainly would not be a layperson. They would have to be initiated to some degree, and most likely in favor of social justice. And this leaves us with one more question. Would this person see us as being distinct from them? Absolutely. When you look at this objectively, and consider the definition of the word community, then I really don't see how you can object to someone using that word to describe us content creators or our audiences for that matter. And if after having been presented all of this, you still don't like and don't want people to use the phrase skeptic community, then what phrase do you want them to use? Do you want them to keep calling us alt-right? I sure as hell don't. Do you want them to just keep calling us the YouTube misogynists? Yeah, I'd really rather they didn't. Seriously, the skeptic community is probably the least bad thing that someone on the outside could refer to us as, so why even complain about it? This is irrational, and they need a word or phrase to distinguish people like us from other groups of people on the internet. They're not trying to imply that we're a homogenous group, they're only trying to identify us as a demographic of YouTube users or people who ingest socio-political media. And you know what? This is the thing that SJWs do. They don't see the meaning behind the words people use. They only see the specific words you use and take issue with it. So why on earth would you do it? So to wrap this up, I think I laid out the case that we are definitely a community by any stretch of the imagination. However, if you still have an issue with us being referred to as a community, then you need to come up with a new phrase for people to use as a shorthand way of identifying people with our particular interests. And while you're at it, could you do me a favor and explain exactly why we're not a community so I don't have to assume your motives? I really don't like doing that, and if we're going to take something as mundane as this and turn it into a talking point, the very least you can do is open up the topic to discussion by actually making an argument against it.
Yes, there is a skeptic community, but that community is connected by only one thing, and that is the fact that they have a shared disbelief in social justice.